The wind moves first through the broken gates, long before any human voice returns to the place. It slides over pale stone, across the remains of walls built for giants, through empty passages where guards once watched the roads of central Anatolia. The city is silent now, but it does not feel small, even in ruin. Hattusa seems to be holding its breath. Its foundations cling to a hard, uneven landscape of ridges, ravines, and high plateaus, where winter can bite through wool and summer dust can turn every path into a pale scar. From these heights, a kingdom once looked outward and saw enemies in every direction. To the south lay Syria, with its rich cities and trade roads. Farther beyond, the shining riverlands of Egypt. To the east, mountain peoples and rival powers. To the west, restless lands full of shifting loyalties. And in the middle of all this danger stood a people history almost forgot the Hittites. For a long time, they were little more than a shadow at the edge of better-known stories. Egypt had its pyramids, its painted tombs, its kings carved into temple walls. Babylon had its legends and law codes. Assyria left behind images of terrifying conquest. But the Hittites seemed to vanish almost completely, as if their empire had been swallowed by the plateau that once protected it. Their capital was abandoned, their language fell silent, the gods lost their temples, their kings, who had spoken as equals with pharaohs, slipped into obscurity so deep that later ages barely knew what to do with the traces they left behind. And yet, in the 13th century before the Common Era, no ruler in the Near East could afford to ignore them. The Hittites were not a minor tribe hiding in the mountains. They were a great imperial power, one of the strongest forces of the Late Bronze Age, commanding armies, controlling vassal kingdoms, writing treaties, moving chariots across contested frontiers, and shaping the fate of cities from Anatolia to northern Syria. Their kings ruled from a capital surrounded by massive stone walls, decorated with carved lions, warrior gods, and monumental gates that were meant to impress as much as defend. Their archives contained thousands of clay tablets, recording laws, rituals, diplomatic letters, military campaigns, royal anxieties, and desperate prayers during times of plague. What survives in the record suggests not a crude warrior horde, but a complex state practical, adaptable, violent when necessary, cautious when wise, and deeply aware that power in the ancient world was never secure. The strange thing is that Egypt remembered them as enemies worthy of fear. The pharaohs were not easily impressed. Egyptian kings liked to show foreigners as defeated, kneeling, bound, or crushed beneath royal sandals. The temple walls often turned war into certainty, transforming difficult campaigns into scenes of divine triumph. But when Egypt met the Hittites in the struggle for Syria, it encountered something different, a rival that could not simply be dismissed. The Hittites controlled the northern approaches to the Levant, commanded strong alliances, and understood the value of both battlefield shock and patient diplomacy. They were the kind of enemy who could make even a pharaoh rethink the map. At the heart of that rivalry stands the Battle of Kadesh, one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, and also one of the most carefully distorted. The Egyptian version, carved in grand reliefs and repeated with royal confidence, presents Rameses II as the heroic centre of the universe, abandoned by danger, surrounded by enemies, then saved by his own courage and divine favour. It is a magnificent story, and like many magnificent royal stories, it is not the whole truth. The Hittite side is quieter, partly because the surviving record is uneven, partly because the Hittites did not preserve the battle in the same theatrical style. Scholars still debate exactly how the fighting unfolded and what the outcome should be called, but the aftermath speaks with a colder clarity than propaganda. Egypt did not crush the Hittites did not disappear, the contested lands remained contested, and eventually the two powers came to terms not as master and servant, but as rivals who had both learned the limits of victory. That is why the Hittites matter. They stand at the point where mythic-looking ancient history becomes something more human, more fragile, and more unsettling. Their world is not a simple tale of kings marching from triumph to triumph. It is a world of droughts and plagues, family betrayals, border crises, vassals changing sides, gods needing to be appeased, and armies that depend on roads, fodder, metal, grain, and the loyalty of men who might decide tomorrow that another king looks stronger. The Hittite Empire was powerful, but it was also exposed. It rose in a landscape that taught caution. It expanded into regions that demanded constant attention. And like so many Bronze Age powers, it depended on networks so wide and delicate that when they began to break, even great walls could not save everything inside them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the story of the Hittites is not simply the story of another ancient empire, it is the story of a civilization that terrified Egypt, then vanished so completely that its recovery became one of archaeology's great acts of historical resurrection. To understand the force that emerged from Hattusa, the eye has to adjust to a different kind of ancient landscape. This is not the flat river world of the Nile, where the annual flood lays a predictable ribbon of fertility across the desert. It is not southern Mesopotamia, where cities rise from alluvial plains under a brutal open sky. Central Anatolia is harder to read. Its valleys are broken, its weather is sharper, its roots twist through mountains and highlands. Agriculture is possible, but it demands resilience. Settlement is possible, but defence matters. Power here grows not from one great river alone, but from controlling movement between regions, the roads that carry tin, textiles, silver, grain, horses, messages, soldiers, and rumours. Long before the Hittites become an empire, Anatolia is already a crossroads of wealth and ambition. Assyrian merchants from Mesopotamia established trading colonies there in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, leaving behind clay tablets that reveal a world of contracts, debts, caravans, marriages, taxes, and risk. These records are a lesser-known doorway into the age before Hittite greatness. They show that central Anatolia was not isolated or primitive. It was plugged into long-distance exchange, especially the trade in tin and textiles, the materials needed for bronze and elite wealth. Local rulers controlled towns and strongholds. Foreign merchants negotiated permissions and protections. Families invested in caravans that could make them rich or ruin them. The landscape that later feeds the Hittite kingdom is already full of political tension, economic opportunity, and cultural mixing. Somewhere in this crowded highland world, the people who would become known as Hittites begin to take shape. Even their name carries a complication. The people themselves often connected their identity with the land of Hatti, an older Anatolian term, while their Indo-European language is known today as Hittite because of later scholarly convention. The older Hattian population, the Indo-European-speaking newcomers or elites, Hurrian influences from the southeast, Mesopotamian scribal habits, and local Anatolian traditions all become tangled together. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact processes by which language, power, and identity fused in early Hittite society. But the result is unmistakable: a kingdom that is never culturally pure in any simple sense, and that may have gained strength precisely because it learned how to absorb. This ability to absorb becomes one of the deep patterns of Hittite history. They borrow scripts from Mesopotamia, gods from conquered or allied peoples, rituals from different regions, and political tools from older states. They do not always erase what they conquer. Often, they incorporate it, rename it, regulate it, and bind it into a larger imperial order. That does not make them gentle. Hittite kings can be ruthless, and their campaigns could leave cities broken. But their power is rarely just destruction. It is also administration, negotiation, oath-making, hostage-taking, marriage alliance, religious adaptation, and the careful use of fear. In the ruins of Hattusa, this mixture still seems to linger. The city does not speak with one voice. It speaks in walls, tablets, sanctuaries, tunnels, and gates. It speaks of a people who understood stone and ceremony, war and paperwork, omens and logistics. It speaks of kings who feared divine anger as much as foreign armies. It speaks of a state that could challenge Egypt and yet worry obsessively over broken oaths, neglected rituals, and the possibility that plague was punishment from offended gods. The Hittites were warriors, but they were not only warriors, they were builders of a nervous empire, always watching the horizon, always measuring loyalty, always aware that the storm could come from outside the walls or from within the royal house itself. And that is where the mystery begins to sharpen. How does a highland kingdom, born from a rough and divided landscape, rise high enough to become the equal of Egypt? How does it project power across hundreds of miles, hold together so many different peoples, and carve its name into the dangerous politics of the late Bronze Age, and why, after reaching such height, does it fade so dramatically that later generations nearly lose it altogether? The stones of Hattusa give no easy answer. They only stand in the wind, massive and mute, marking the place where a forgotten power once looked south toward Egypt and made the greatest kings of the Nile take notice. Before the Hittites have a name that later historians can recognize, central Anatolia is already alive with ambition. The plateau does not wait in silence for empire to arrive. It is crowded with towns, fortified hill settlements, local rulers, merchants, herders, farmers, smiths, and messengers moving along difficult roads where weather and politics can be equally dangerous. The land itself seems to resist easy control. Mountains divide one valley from another. Rivers cut through high country but do not create a single, predictable world like the Nile. A ruler who wants power here must do more than command fields. He must command passages, loyalty, metal, animals, and information. He must know which town can be trusted, which road is safe in winter, which neighbour is preparing betrayal, and which merchants carry wealth worth taxing or stealing. The older world of Anatolia is not a blank stage. Long before Hattusa becomes the capital of a great kingdom, this region has already seen deep layers of settlement and cultural change. People farm, herd, build, worship, bury their dead, and trade across generations whose names are mostly lost. Some communities live in small villages, others gather around stronger centres where local princes or chiefs can dominate surrounding lands. The highlands produce timber, livestock, stone, and access to metal resources, but their greatest advantage may be position. Anatolia lies between worlds. To the southeast are the rich traditions of Mesopotamia, with their cities, scribes, and commercial networks. To the south and west are routes towards Syria, the Mediterranean, and the Aegean. To the east are mountain zones and peoples who can be partners one season and enemies the next. Whoever controls central Anatolia is never merely local. He stands in the path of exchange. This is where the Assyrian merchant colonies become so important. Around the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, merchants from the city of Ashur established trading communities in Anatolia, most famously at Kadesh, also known as Nisa. They are not conquering armies. They are business families, agents, creditors, caravan organisers, and scribes. They move textiles and tin northward and carry silver and other goods back south. Tin is especially vital because bronze, the dominant military and practical metal of the age, depends on copper mixed with tin. A world of bronze tools and weapons is therefore also a world of long-distance dependency. The sword in a warrior's hand, the axe in a worker's grip, and the prestige goods of elites may all depend on materials that have travelled across dangerous distances. The tablets from these merchant communities are among the most intimate documents from ancient Anatolia. They do not tell grand heroic stories. They talk about loans, shipments, lawsuits, taxes, family disputes, unpaid debts, caravan losses, and marriage arrangements. That makes them unexpectedly vivid. They show people worrying about profit margins and trust, about whether a partner has cheated them, whether a shipment has arrived, whether a local ruler has raised demands. Whether silver owed months ago will ever be repaid. In that paperwork, the ancient world becomes less distant. One can almost hear the irritation of merchants who have risked too much on a road, controlled by someone else's soldiers. What survives in the record suggests that the future land of the Hittites was already bound into a commercial system that rewarded calculation and punished weakness. Kadesh itself matters for another reason. The Hittite language is sometimes called Nesite in ancient sources, connecting it with Nisa. This small clue opens a much larger problem. Who exactly were the early Hittites? The answer is not simple. The word Hittite is a modern scholarly label drawn from biblical and ancient references to the land of Hatti, but the people who built the empire inherited a region already known by older names. The Hattians, whose language was not Indo-European, had deep roots in central Anatolia. The Hittite language, by contrast, belongs to the Indo-European family, making it related in a distant way to languages that would later include Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and many others. But language does not equal blood, and the movement of languages through ancient societies is rarely neat. Scholars still debate how Indo-European speaking groups entered or emerged in Anatolia, how they interacted with older populations, and how quickly they gained political influence. The evidence remains incomplete, but the result is visible in the culture that follows. Hittite civilization is layered. Its kings use an Indo-European language in official texts, but they rule over people with varied backgrounds. They preserve Hattian divine names and religious traditions. They borrow Mesopotamian scribal practices. They absorb Hurrian rituals and myths from the southeast. They interact with Luwian-speaking populations in western and southern Anatolia. Instead of a single ethnic bloc suddenly arriving and replacing everything before it, the picture is more like a fusion under pressure. Different traditions survive because they are useful, sacred, prestigious, or too deeply rooted to erase. This helps explain one of the most distinctive features of the later Hittite state, its appetite for incorporation. The Hittites often behave like collectors of power. They collect gods, treaties, languages, rituals, vassals, specialists, and foreign customs. They do not appear embarrassed by borrowing. In fact, borrowing becomes a tool of rule. If a conquered city has an important goddess, the Hittites may bring her into their own religious world rather than dismiss her. If a foreign ritual is believed to work, it can be written down and performed. If a Mesopotamian scribal system gives authority and administrative reach, they adapt it. If a local ruler can be bound by oath instead of destroyed outright, he may be turned into a vassal. This is not tolerance in a modern sentimental sense. It is imperial practicality, sharpened by the realities of governing a fractured landscape. The world before the Hittite kingdom is also politically unstable. Anatolia contains multiple small kingdoms and city-states, each with its own ruler, interests, and rivalries. Hattusa itself, before becoming the Hittite capital, appears as one of these centres. Early traditions remember a king named Anita, associated with Kadesh, who defeats Hattusa and curses the site, warning that whoever settles it again should face divine punishment. The detail is striking. Partly because later Hittite kings do exactly what the curse forbids. They rebuild Hattusa and make it their royal seat. No single explanation fully accounts for this decision, but it suggests that the site's strategic value outweighed the memory of danger. A cursed stronghold in the right position could become irresistible. The choice reveals the brutal logic of the age. Sacred warnings matter, but geography matters too. Hattusa sits in a landscape well suited for defence, with natural ridges and approaches that can be fortified. It is not the easiest place from which to rule a wide empire, but it is a hard place to take, and that matters in a world of raiders, rival kings, and sudden reversals. The Hittites do not rise because their homeland is gentle, they rise because it is difficult. And because difficulty teaches habits that river kingdoms do not always need in the same way, their rulers must bargain and threaten, adapt and endure. They must learn to make a state out of broken terrain. So before the first great Hittite king stepped fully into view, the foundations are already there: old Anatolian traditions, Assyrian trade, local dynasties, sacred landscapes, fortified towns, multilingual populations, and the constant pressure of competition. The future empire is not born from emptiness. It grows from a crowded and nervous world where every road carries opportunity and danger together. The Hittites will eventually terrify Egypt, but before they can face the pharaohs, they must first master the highlands that made them. Hattusa does not rise like a city meant to flatter the eye from a distance. It rises like a challenge. The capital takes shape among steep slopes, rocky outcrops, narrow approaches, and uneven ground that forces every visitor to feel the landscape before seeing the throne behind it. A city on a flat plain can display wealth in broad avenues and open symmetry, but Hattusa is different. It seems to grow out of the highland itself, using ridge and ravine as part of its design. Its builders do not fight the terrain so much as recruit it. Walls follow the land's broken lines. Gates appear where movement can be watched and controlled. Sacred spaces and royal structures occupy places that feel chosen not only for convenience, but for drama, visibility, and defence. For a kingdom trying to survive in central Anatolia, this matters. The Hittites are not protected by a single river valley or by deserts on either side. Their homeland is exposed to rival centres, mountain groups, rebellious towns, and shifting alliances. A capital must be more than an administrative seat. It must be a fortress, a symbol, a storehouse, a ritual centre, and a warning. Hattusa becomes all of these at once. Its walls eventually stretch for kilometres, enclosing an upper and lower city, monumental gates, temples, residences, archives, and hidden routes through the fortifications. The sheer size of the place tells any approaching envoy that this is not a hill town pretending to be royal. It is a capital built to announce permanence in a world where permanence is never guaranteed. One of the most striking features of Hattusa is the way its entrances turn architecture into political theatre. The Lion Gate, with its carved animals guarding the passage, speaks in a language older than writing strength. Danger, protection, royal authority. The King's Gate, with its armed figure carved in stone, offers a different message, one of order enforced by violence. The Sphinx Gate, high and imposing, adds a more mysterious presence, suggesting links between defence, divinity, and the guarded threshold between ordinary space and royal space. These gates are not merely practical openings, they are statements. They tell the visitor that crossing into Hattusa means entering a world controlled by the king, watched by gods, and defended by forces both human and supernatural. The famous postern tunnel beneath part of the fortification adds another layer to the city's character. It is a stone-lined passage running under the walls, carefully built and still walkable in modern times. Its exact function remains debated. It may have allowed movement during siege, served as a controlled access route, or carried symbolic meaning connected with the underworld or ritual passage. The evidence remains incomplete, but the tunnel captures something essential about Hattusa. This city is both practical and strange. It is engineered for defence, but also shaped by beliefs that do not separate stone from spirit. In the Hittite mind, a wall is a military tool, but it may also be part of a sacred order. A gate is an entrance, but it is also a place where danger, authority, and divine protection meet. Inside the city, the lower area contains the Great Temple, one of the largest religious complexes of the Hittite world. It is usually associated with the storm god and the sun goddess, central figures in the state's religious imagination. Around it are storerooms, courtyards, and rooms where offerings, objects, and records could be kept. The temple is not simply a place of prayer in the narrow sense, it is an economic and administrative organism. Food, drink, textiles, vessels, and ritual materials move through it. Priests, officials, workers, and scribes sustain it. The gods of Hattusa require service, and that service requires organisation. In this way, religion and bureaucracy become inseparable. To honour the gods properly, someone must count, store, deliver, assign, and record. This is where Hattusa begins to reveal the intelligence behind Hittite power. The empire is remembered for warriors and chariots, but it also depends on clay tablets. Thousands of tablets and fragments found in the capital preserve treaties, laws, instructions, rituals, myths, inventories, diplomatic letters, historical narratives, and prayers. Some are written in Hittite, others in Akkadian, Hurrian, Hattian, or other languages used in ritual and scholarship. The archives show a kingdom that takes writing seriously, not as decoration, but as a technology of control. Oaths can be recorded, vassal obligations can be fixed in formal language, rituals can be preserved step by step, royal deeds can be shaped into memory, disputes can be judged through precedent, messages can cross frontiers with authority attached to them. A lesser-known but revealing detail is how multilingual the archive world of Hattusa truly is. The capital is not a place where one language simply dominates every corner of elite life. Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, connects Hittite kings to other great powers. Hattian survives in religious context, preserving older sacred traditions. Hurrian materials reflect strong cultural influence from the southeast. Luwian appears in the wider Anatolian world and becomes especially important in later periods. This mixture is not accidental clutter. It is the written form of an empire that rules over diversity and uses diversity as part of its authority. The Hittite king can present himself as lord of many lands, partly because his capital has learned to speak in many inherited voices. Yet Hattusa is not a comfortable capital in every sense. Its location is impressive, but also demanding. The city sits in a region with harsh winters and limited agricultural land immediately around it. Supplying a large population, royal court, temples, craft specialists, animals, and military needs requires planning. Grain must be gathered from surrounding territories. Herds must be managed. Water must be secured. Roads must remain usable. The city's grandeur depends on a wider system of extraction and coordination. What appears as stone strength on the surface rests on a fragile chain of labour. harvest, loyalty, and weather. If the chain holds, Hattusa looks invincible. If it breaks, the city's very scale becomes a burden. This tension runs through the whole Hittite story. Hattusa is magnificent because it solves problems, but every solution creates new dependence. Fortifications defend the capital, but they require maintenance and manpower. Archives preserve authority, but they also reveal how many promises must be monitored. Temples bind gods to the king, but they demand constant ritual attention. Storehouses protect against scarcity, but only if grain continues to arrive. The capital is a machine of empire. And like all machines, it must be fed. By the time Hattusa stands fully as a royal city, the Hittites have transformed an old and contested site into the heart of a new political order. The curse remembered from earlier days has not prevented occupation. If anything, it makes the choice feel even more forceful. The kings who settle here are not merely inheriting a place, they are overturning its past, claiming danger, and turning it into legitimacy. From these walls, they will reach outward into Anatolia, then Syria, then the diplomatic world of the great kings. The roads that once carried merchants and rumours will begin to carry armies, royal messengers, tribute, captives, and treaties sealed before gods. And still, beneath the grandeur, the old highland uncertainty remains. Hattusa can command, but it must also listen. Every ridge beyond the city may conceal resistance. Every vassal oath may someday need enforcement. Every god neglected may become dangerous in the mind of the court. Capital gives the Hittites a centre, but not peace. It gives them walls, but not safety. It gives them a stage large enough for empire, and on that stage, the early kings began to build through a mixture of violence, calculation, and fear. The first Hittite kings do not inherit an empire. They force one into being. Behind the later image of treaties, archives, and royal ceremony stands a much harsher beginning. A world of rival towns, unstable dynasties, raids, revenge, and sudden reversals. Power in early Hittite Anatolia is personal before it is institutional. A king's authority depends on his bloodline, his household, his warriors, his gods, and his ability to reward loyalty before someone else buys it away. The throne is not yet a calm object resting at the centre of government. It is a prize surrounded by danger, and the men who reach it often do so with blood on their hands or blood at their backs. One of the earliest great figures to emerge from this turbulent world is Hattusili I, remembered as a founder-like king, even though the details of his reign remain partly shadowed. His very name links him to Hattusa, the city that earlier tradition claimed had been cursed after its destruction. By taking that city as his seat, Hattusili seems to transform forbidden ground into royal destiny. The act is bold, perhaps even defiant. It suggests that the new dynasty is not afraid to step over older warnings if the reward is strategic power. Hattusa gives him a fortress capital in the Anatolian heartland, and from there his ambitions stretch outward. The early campaigns associated with Hattusili I show the pattern of a kingdom testing its strength in multiple directions. He fights in Anatolia, pushes toward northern Syria, and brings Hittite power into contact with richer, older, more urban worlds to the south. This movement is crucial. Central Anatolia can produce tough rulers and defensible cities, but Syria offers roads, wealth, prestige, and access to the international politics of the age. To campaign there is not merely to raid. It is to announce that the Hittite king belongs in the same dangerous arena as the older powers of the Near East. What survives in the record suggests that Hattusili's reign is remembered as expansive and violent, but also unstable. Conquest is easier to begin than to secure. The human cost of that instability appears most sharply in the famous Testament of Hattusili, a text that feels unusually personal for such an ancient royal document. It presents the aging king dealing with betrayal, succession, and disappointment inside his own family. The exact historical circumstances are debated, and the text is shaped by political purpose, but its emotional force is difficult to miss. The king is not only fighting foreign enemies, he's trying to prevent his own house from tearing apart what he has built. He rejects one heir, elevates another, and warns the court about obedience. In a world where royal blood is supposed to guarantee continuity, blood itself becomes a threat. The heir he chooses, Masili I, carries Hittite ambition even farther. Under Masili, the kingdom launches one of the most astonishing campaigns of the Bronze Age, the attack on Babylon, far to the southeast. Around the 16th century before the Common Era, Hittite forces reach the great Mesopotamian city and sack it, bringing an end to the dynasty associated with Hammurabi. The event is startling because it shows the reach of Dabuli Hittite arms. A power from the Anatolian highlands can strike into the symbolic heart of Mesopotamian civilization, yet the victory also reveals the limits of raid-like conquest. The Hittites do not remain to rule Babylon, they withdraw, and the long-term political advantage goes elsewhere. It is a spectacular blow, but not a stable possession. This is one of the recurring truths of Hittite history. The Hittites can move with terrifying force, but distance is unforgiving. Armies must eat, horses must be maintained, chariots need roads and repairs, garrisons require loyalty. A conquered city is not truly conquered if the king cannot afford to watch it. The sack of Babylon proves that the Hittites are dangerous, but it also shows that danger and durable empire are not the same thing. No single campaign can solve the deeper problem of governing across mountains, rivers, languages, and rival traditions. Masili's own fate sharpens the lesson. After his victories, he is assassinated, apparently as part of a palace conspiracy. The king who helped bring down Babylon cannot secure his own life at home. In the aftermath, the Hittite kingdom enters a period of internal disorder, with coups, murders, and succession struggles weakening royal authority. Later, Hittite tradition remembers this as a time when violence within the royal family became almost habitual. Whether every detail is recoverable or not, the pattern is clear enough: the early kingdom's greatest enemy is not always beyond the frontier. Sometimes it sits inside the palace, waiting for the right moment. It takes later rulers, especially Telepinu, to confront this problem directly. Telepinu's proclamation is one of the most important documents for understanding early Hittite political thought. It looks back on the chaos of royal murders and attempts to impose rules for succession, limiting the destructive competition that had repeatedly thrown the kingdom into crisis. The text does not read like a modern constitution, but it shows a striking awareness that unchecked dynastic violence can destroy a state from within. Telepinu tries to turn royal inheritance from a battlefield into a procedure. The evidence remains incomplete, and rules on clay do not always control ambition in life, but the attempt itself reveals a practical intelligence at the heart of Hittite kingship. This practicality appears in Hittite law as well. Compared with some ancient law collections, Hittite laws can seem less obsessed with spectacular punishments and more concerned with compensation, property, injury, status, and restoration of order. That does not make Hittite society gentle or equal. It remains hierarchical, patriarchal, and capable of severe penalties. But there is often a notable concern with assessing damages and repairing social balance through payment or replacement. A stolen animal, an injury, a damaged field, a broken obligation, these are treated not only as moral offences but as disruptions to a functioning community. In a kingdom built from many local societies, such legal pragmatism matters. The king must punish, but he must also keep producers producing, soldiers serving, and households intact. The Hittite ruler is therefore not simply a warlord, though war is central to his authority. He is judge, commander, priestly figure, negotiator, and guardian of oaths. His power depends on success in battle, but also on his ability to bind others into predictable relationships. This is where the later Hittite genius for treaty-making begins to make sense. A world of unstable loyalties requires formal promises. Those promises require witnesses. And in the Hittite imagination, the most powerful witnesses are the gods. To break an oath is not just to offend the king, it is to invite divine punishment, sickness, famine, defeat, or the ruin of one's descendants. Law, politics, religion, and fear become braided together. Still, none of these tools removes the violence at the foundation. The early Hittite kingdom grows because its rulers can destroy rivals, seize cities, and project force beyond the plateau. But it survives because some of them understand that violence must be organised into institutions. A raid can bring treasure, a murder can bring a throne. Neither can build a lasting empire by itself. The Hittites slowly learn to transform conquest into administration, family danger into succession rules, local obedience into oath-bound vassalage, and sacred anxiety into state ritual. By the time the kingdom emerges from its early storms, it has acquired habits that will define its greatness. It is hard, suspicious, adaptable, and deeply political. Its rulers know that glory can collapse overnight if brothers, sons, commanders, or vassals decide to gamble against the crown. They also know that enemies beyond Anatolia are watching. To the south, Syria remains the prize that draws Hittite ambition like a flame draws night insects. Beyond Syria lies Egypt, wealthy, ancient, and certain of its own grandeur. The Hittites are not ready yet to terrify the pharaohs, but the machinery is forming kings who understand war, scribes who preserve command, laws that steady society, and a capital built to hold firm while armies move outward. The secret of Hittite power is not a single invention, not one miraculous weapon pulled from the mountains, not a hidden technology that suddenly makes them masters of the Bronze Age. Their strength is more difficult to see because it is made of many parts working together: horses, chariots, bronze, trained crews, disciplined movement, vassal troops, fortified roads, royal commands, and the ability to make distant communities serve a campaign they may not personally care about. The Hittites frighten their enemies not because they are mysterious supermen of war, but because they become very good at turning a hard landscape and a mixed empire into military force. The chariot stands at the centre of that image. In the late Bronze Age, the chariot is not just a vehicle, it is speed, prestige, shock, and royal theatre. It requires horses bred and trained with care, skilled drivers, warriors able to fight from a moving platform, carpenters who understand wheels and light construction, leatherworkers, metalworkers, grooms, and commanders who can coordinate movement across open ground. A chariot force is expensive before it ever reaches battle. It consumes fodder, equipment, time, and expertise. For that reason, chariots belong to states that can organise resources beyond the village level. When a king fields chariots, he's showing not merely courage but administration. Hittite chariots are often described as heavier than Egyptian ones, and there is some truth in the broad contrast, though the details should be handled carefully. Egyptian chariots are usually imagined as lighter, fast-moving platforms suited to archery and manoeuvre. Hittite chariots, especially in traditional reconstructions of battles like Kadesh, are often presented as carrying 3 men a driver, a shield bearer, and a fighter, making them more suitable for shock action against enemy formations. Scholars still debate exactly how standardized these differences were, and artistic and textual evidence can be difficult to interpret. Still, what survives in the record suggests that the Hittites understood the battlefield value of massed chariot charges, especially when used to disrupt an opponent at a crucial moment. But a chariot does not win a war by itself. It must arrive in the right place, at the right time, with horses still strong enough to move. That means logistics, grain for men, fodder for animals, spare parts for wheels and axles, water sources, camp discipline, scouts, interpreters, guides, and secure routes all matter. Ancient armies could die slowly before battle if supply failed. They could also dissolve politically if allied contingents felt neglected, cheated, or endangered. The Hittite king often fought not only with his own troops, but with forces drawn from vassal states and dependent regions. Such armies could be large and impressive, but they were also complicated. A vassal sends men because an oath, a treaty, fear, or advantage compels him. If royal power looks weak, that same vassal may hesitate, delay, or rebel. This is why the Hittite military system cannot be separated from diplomacy. Every treaty is also a military document. It defines obligations, tribute, troop support, loyalty, extradition, and punishment for betrayal. The gods are invoked not for decoration, but as enforcers of obedience. A vassal who breaks faith risks more than human revenge. In Hittite political thought, he risks divine disaster. Whether every vassal believed this with equal terror is impossible to know. But the formula is powerful. It turns politics into sacred obligation and makes military service part of a cosmic order. The Empire's armies are therefore assembled not only by command, but by written promises backed by fear of heaven and earth. The question of iron often hovers around the Hittites like a legend. Popular imagination has sometimes cast them as masters of iron technology, who gained power because they possessed a secret metal that others lacked. The truth is more restrained and more interesting. The Hittites did know iron, and iron objects carried great prestige in the Late Bronze Age. Some were rare, valuable, and possibly associated with gift exchange among elites. But the Hittite Empire is not best understood as an Iron Age war machine conquering bronze-armed neighbours with mass-produced iron weapons. Widespread iron use comes later, after the Bronze Age collapse. In the Hittite period, bronze remains crucial. The idea of a Hittite monopoly on practical iron weaponry is disputed and oversimplified. Their real advantage lies less in secret metal than in political organisation, military adaptation, and access to the resources needed for elite warfare. That correction matters because it makes the Hittites more impressive, not less. A fantasy of superior metal is easy. Building an empire without such a simple advantage is harder. The Hittites must manage copper and tin supplies, maintain smiths, equip troops, and keep aristocratic warriors loyal. They must train horses in lands where climate and terrain can be unforgiving. They must move armies from the Anatolian plateau into Syria, where heat, distance, and rival powers test every plan. They must coordinate infantry and chariotry, local knowledge and royal ambition. War is not just the clash shown on monuments. It is months of preparation and countless decisions that no artist bothers to carve. One of the lesser-known windows into Hittite military culture comes from horse training texts associated with a trainer named Kikili, whose methods reflect hurry and influence and show remarkable attention to conditioning. These texts include detailed routines for feeding, watering, exercising, and resting horses over extended periods. They are not heroic literature, they are technical instruction, almost dry in their precision, yet they reveal something profound. Hittite power depends on disciplined care. A horse that is badly trained or badly fed can ruin the performance of an elite chariot unit. Behind the dramatic charge stands the patient routine measured exercise, controlled diet, recovery, repetition. Empires are sometimes built in stables as much as on battlefields. The Hittites also understand fortification and siege. Though siege warfare in this period is often slow, brutal, and uncertain, cities can resist behind walls, especially if well supplied. A king may devastate fields, capture smaller settlements, pressure allies, or wait for hunger and fear to do what direct assault cannot. Hittite campaigns often involve the management of rebellious cities and vassal territories. Victory may mean forcing submission rather than annihilating every wall. This creates an empire full of negotiated violence. The king must be feared enough that resistance seems foolish, but not so destructive that every defeated region becomes useless afterward. There is a cold practicality in this. The Hittites do not need every enemy dead. They need obedience, troops, taxes, hostages, and secure roads. A defeated ruler can sometimes remain in place if bound tightly enough by oath. A conquered god can be honoured, a local elite can be folded into the imperial system, but if rebellion repeats, punishment can be severe. This combination of flexibility and threat gives Hittite power its particular edge. They are not simply raiders pouring out of the mountains, they are managers of coercion. By the time Hittite armies begin to dominate northern Syria, the Egyptians have reason to pay attention. Egypt is wealthy and ancient, but wealth does not automatically control distant frontiers. The Levant is a corridor of cities, ports, trade routes, and competing loyalties. A Hittite army arriving there brings not only chariots, but a whole machinery of pressure treaties, vassals, royal demands, hostage politics, and the memory of what happens to those who choose the wrong side. The terror they inspire is not mindless panic. It is the recognition that this highland power can reach far, strike hard, and then bind the survivors into a system designed to make resistance costly. Still, the machinery has weaknesses. Chariot warfare depends on terrain, horses depend on supply, vassals depend on confidence, bronze depends on trade, command depends on communication. Every strength creates a vulnerability. The same military network that allows the Hittites to project power also stretches them thin. The same vassal armies that enlarge the king's force can become unreliable if the centre falters. The same prestige of the chariot makes the state dependent on specialists, animals and materials that cannot be improvised overnight. For now, however, the system works well enough to make Hatti one of the great powers of its age. From Hattusa, commands travel outward. In stables, horses are conditioned. In workshops, weapons and fittings are prepared. In subject lands, rulers count the cost of obedience and rebellion. On the road south, armies begin moving toward the regions where empire becomes truly dangerous. The Hittites have learned how to turn stone, oath, bronze, horseflesh, and fear into force. Soon that force will collide not only with border kingdoms, but with the oldest and most self-confident monarchy in the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt. The Hittites go to war with bronze, horses, oaths, and carefully organised fear, but they do not imagine that these things alone can hold the world together. Above the king, above the army, above the walls of Hattusa, there is a crowded and dangerous divine order. The Hittite Empire is filled with gods. Some are ancient gods of the Anatolian land, some arrived through conquest, some come from Hurrian tradition, some are carried in from Syria, and some are known through the wider religious language of Mesopotamia. Later scribes sometimes call them the 1,000 gods of Hatti, a phrase that feels almost exaggerated until the archives begin to reveal how many divine names, rituals, festivals, and sacred obligations the state tries to remember. The Hittite king rules a human empire, but he also manages a divine population that seems nearly as complicated as his vassal kingdoms. This religious world is not separate from politics. It is politics under another sky. If a city is conquered, its gods matter. If a treaty is sworn, gods witness it. If a plague strikes, gods may have caused it. If a king breaks an oath, gods may punish not only him but his land, his sons, his soldiers, and his harvests. The Hittites do not treat divine anger as a poetic idea. They treat it as an active force in history, a failed campaign, a sickness in the royal family, a famine, a strange omen, or a sudden military reversal can all become signs that something has gone wrong between humans and the unseen powers who sustain the kingdom. In such a world, ruling requires more than command. It requires constant ritual attention and perhaps constant anxiety. The storm god stands near the centre of this universe. In the highlands of Anatolia, where weather can mean survival or ruin, the storm is not an abstraction. It is thunder over mountains, rain over fields, snow on roads, hail against crops, and the force that can make the land fruitful or hostile. The storm god is royal, martial, and deeply connected with the authority of the Hittite state. Beside him, the sun goddess of Arinna holds immense importance, associated with sovereignty, justice, and the sacred legitimacy of kingship. The royal house does not merely honour these deities as private devotion. It depends on them. Their favour makes rule possible. Their anger can make even the strongest fortress feel exposed. But the Hittite pantheon is never tidy. It expands as the empire expands. Hattian deities remain embedded in ritual life. Hurrian gods, especially from the southeast, become increasingly influential, including Teshub, another great storm god, and the goddess Hibat. Syrian and Mesopotamian elements enter as well. The Hittites are not embarrassed by this accumulation. They seem almost determined not to leave any powerful divine force outside the system. If a god belongs to a conquered or allied people, that god may be honoured, listed, invoked, and woven into royal ritual. This can look like tolerance, but it is also strategy. To rule a land, one must reckon with the gods of that land. Ignoring them would be dangerous, not enlightened. The rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, near Hattusa, offers one of the most haunting images of this sacred order. There, figures of gods and goddesses are carved into the living rock, advancing in solemn procession across stone walls under the open sky. The place does not feel like an ordinary temple room. It feels like a meeting point between landscape and divine presence. The carved deities, many reflecting Hurrian influence, appear in ordered movement, as if the supernatural world itself has been arranged for royal and ritual purposes. Scholars still debate the full meaning of the sanctuary, including its possible connections with festivals, royal ancestors, cosmology, or the marking of sacred time. The evidence remains incomplete, but the effect is unmistakable. The Hittite kings are placing themselves in relation to a cosmic assembly, one that is both protective and potentially terrifying. Ritual fills the archives of Hattusa because ritual is one of the main technologies by which danger is managed. There are rituals for purification, rituals against curses, rituals for royal illness, rituals connected with birth, death, oath, war, plague, and pollution. Some are elaborate, involving offerings, symbolic substitutions, animals, bread, water, fire, figurines, and spoken formulas. Others preserve traditions from different ethnic or regional backgrounds. A foreign ritual can be copied because the question is not whether it is native, but whether it works. This practicality gives Hittite religion a strangely technical quality. The sacred is mysterious, but it is also procedural. If impurity has entered the palace, there may be steps to remove it. If the gods have been neglected, there may be offerings to restore balance. If an oath has been broken, consequences may need to be discovered, confessed, and appeased. The plague prayers of King Masili II reveal this mentality with painful clarity. During his reign, the Hittite land suffers a devastating plague, apparently lasting many years. The king turns to the gods, searching for the reason. He does not simply ask for mercy in vague language. He investigates divine anger almost like a legal case. He looks backward into the sins of previous kings, into broken oaths, neglected duties, and possible offences that might explain why the land is being punished. These prayers are among the most human documents from the Hittite world. They show a king who is powerful enough to command armies, yet helpless before disease. They also show a mind trained to see disaster as moral and ritual evidence. Somewhere, something has gone wrong. The task is to find it before the kingdom weakens beyond repair. No single explanation fully accounts for the plague itself. It may have spread through war, captives, troop movement, or wider regional disease patterns. Ancient texts cannot provide modern epidemiology, but the Hittite reaction is revealing. The king does not separate public health from divine order, because his world offers no such clean division. A plague is medical, political, military, agricultural, and religious all at once. It kills workers, soldiers, priests, and officials. It weakens campaigns and unsettles succession. It raises the possibility that the gods have withdrawn favour. In that sense, disease becomes a threat to imperial ideology as much as to bodies. The gods also stand behind Hittite diplomacy. Treaties often invoke long lists of divine witnesses, gods of heaven and earth, mountains, rivers, springs, seas, winds, storm gods, sun deities, and the gods of both parties. The list can feel overwhelming, but that is the point. A treaty is not merely an agreement between two rulers. It is spoken before the entire sacred structure of the world. If a vassal betrays the Hittite king, the punishment clauses call down destruction in vivid terms. Loss of family, land, health, crops, and divine protection. In a world where written enforcement across distance is difficult, supernatural enforcement becomes politically useful. Fear of the gods extends the king's reach beyond the range of his army. Yet Hittite religion is not only fear, it is also festival, procession, music, food, royal presence, seasonal rhythm, and the repeated effort to keep humans and gods in proper relation. The king and queen perform important religious roles. They travel, participate in ceremonies, sponsor offerings, and embody the connection between palace and pantheon. This can be exhausting. The ritual calendar is heavy, and royal absence or neglect may be seen as dangerous. A king cannot simply fight wherever he wishes without considering the sacred duties waiting at home. The empire's military ambitions and religious obligations sometimes pull against each other, adding another layer to the constant strain of rule. This is the deeper world behind the Hittite warriors who alarm Egypt. Their armies are not marching out of a society that thinks only in terms of conquest. They come from a kingdom where every campaign may require omens, vows, offerings, and treaty curses, where foreign gods may be brought into the imperial fold, where a plague can be interpreted as the echo of a dead king's crime, where the storm over the mountains is both weather and divine sign. The Hittites are practical, but their practicality includes the invisible. They count grain and horses, but also sins and rituals. They build walls, but they also ask whether the gods still stand behind those walls. As Hatti grows into a great power, this divine complexity becomes both strength and burden. It helps the empire absorb peoples and sanctify political order. It gives treaties terrifying weight. It offers tools for explaining disaster and restoring confidence, but it also multiplies obligations. More lands mean more gods mean more rituals mean more ways to fail. The Hittite king stands at the centre of a crowded empire, hearing demands from soldiers, scribes, vassals, priests, ancestors, and deities whose anger cannot be ignored. And beyond the mountains, other great kings are doing the same in their own sacred languages. The world of the Late Bronze Age is becoming a world of giants, and the Hittites are about to step fully among them. By the time the Hittites stand fully among the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, the world around them has become a dangerous web of kings who call one another brother while preparing for betrayal. This is not a world of isolated civilizations rising separately in their own valleys. It is an international system, fragile but sophisticated, tied together by trade, marriage, diplomacy, gifts, threats, hostage arrangements, and carefully worded letters carried across mountains and deserts. A decision made in Hattusa can disturb a city in Syria. A marriage negotiated in Egypt can affect the pride of a king in Babylon. A rebellion in a border kingdom can invite armies from two empires at once. The Hittites are no longer merely a highland power trying to master Anatolia. They are players in a crowded arena where prestige can be as important as territory, and where a ruler's title carries weight only if others agree to treat it seriously. The great kings of this age form a narrow and jealous club. Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, and sometimes other powers depending on the period and political reality, communicate through a language of equality that is both elegant and tense. In diplomatic letters, rulers exchange greetings, gifts, complaints, demands, and family news, often addressing one another as brothers. The word sounds warm, but it does not mean friendship in the simple sense. It means rank. A brother is an equal. A lesser king is not a brother. He is a servant, a vassal, a man expected to obey. For the Hittites, being recognized as a great kingdom is therefore not only symbolic, it is a claim to stand on the same level as Egypt and Babylon, to enter the conversation of the strongest rulers on earth. This international world is held together by bronze, and bronze is held together by movement. Copper and tin do not always come from the same places. Luxury goods move across great distances: lapis lazuli, gold, silver, fine textiles, horses, ivory, woods, oils, glass, and crafted objects meant to prove that a king is generous and magnificent. Royal gifts are never just gifts. They are statements of status. If one king sends too little gold, another may complain. If a promised bride does not arrive, suspicion grows. If a vassal city changes allegiance, the issue becomes not local disobedience but an insult to imperial honour. The surface language of diplomacy is polished. Beneath it lies constant calculation. For the Hittites, the most important frontier of this wider world is Syria. Northern Syria is not a distant ornament to imperial pride. It is a strategic prize. Its cities sit along trade routes connecting Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Its river valleys and urban centres offer wealth, manpower, and access to international politics. Control there allows the Hittites to reach beyond their highland base and place pressure on the same corridor Egypt considers vital to its northern security. Syria is where geography turns rivalry into inevitability. The Hittites look south, Egypt looks north. Between them lie cities that must choose, resist, negotiate, or suffer. Before the Hittites become Egypt's main rival in this region, another great power dominates much of northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia. Mitanni. Mitanni is a Hurrian-speaking kingdom with an elite culture deeply connected to chariot warfare and aristocratic power. For a time, it stands as one of the major forces between Hatti, Assyria, and Egypt. Its influence reaches into Syria, and its alliances shape the balance of the Near East. Egypt, especially during the 18th dynasty, deals with Mitanni not merely as an enemy, but eventually as a diplomatic partner. Royal marriages and gift exchanges help stabilize relations. This creates a world in which the Hittites cannot simply push south without confronting a larger order already in place. The Hittite king, Suppiluliuma I, changes that order dramatically. He is one of the most formidable rulers in Hittite history, a king whose campaigns and diplomacy transform Hatti from a powerful Anatolian kingdom into an empire that can challenge the strongest states of the age. His rise comes after periods of difficulty, when Hittite authority had been threatened and the kingdom's position was not guaranteed. That makes his success even more striking. He rebuilds power, campaigns aggressively, and exploits weakness in Mitanni through a combination of military pressure, political manipulation, and opportunism. He breaks Mitanni's dominance and brings much of northern Syria under Hittite influence. The evidence for these events is rich in places and frustratingly incomplete in others. Hittite records preserve royal perspectives, while Egyptian and Near Eastern sources provide their own fragments. Scholars still debate the chronology of some events and the precise sequence of campaigns. But the broad result is clear. Mitanni declines as a great power. Assyria begins to rise in the east, and Hatti becomes the dominant force in northern Syria. This is a turning point of enormous consequence. Once the Hittites hold Syrian vassal kingdoms, they are no longer a problem Egypt can ignore. They have moved into the zone where Egyptian prestige, trade, and security are directly involved. One of the most extraordinary episodes from the reign of Suppiluliuma reveals how deeply the Hittites had entered the world of international monarchy. After the death of an Egyptian pharaoh, an Egyptian queen, often identified by scholars with the widow of Tutankhamun though the matter remains debated, sends a message to Suppiluliuma asking for one of his sons to become her husband and king of Egypt. The request is astonishing. Egypt almost never accepts foreign rule in such a form. And a Hittite prince on the Egyptian throne would have changed the politics of the Near East beyond recognition. Suppiluliuma is suspicious at first, as any sensible king would be. He sends envoys to verify the offer. Eventually, a Hittite prince is sent, but he dies before reaching the throne, apparently murdered on the way. The episode is one of those historical moments where the surviving evidence opens a door and then refuses to let anyone fully through. The queen's identity, the motives of the Egyptian court, the exact route of the prince, and the forces behind his death remain debated. But the story's significance is not in every unresolved detail. It shows that Hatti and Egypt are now entangled at the highest possible level. A Hittite prince could be imagined, however briefly and desperately, as a solution to an Egyptian succession crisis. That alone tells us how far Hittite prestige has risen. The aftermath is darker. Suppiluliuma responds with anger, and conflict follows. Hittite prisoners brought back from campaigns may have carried disease into Anatolia, contributing to the devastating plague that later haunts the reign of Mursili II. No single explanation fully accounts for the plague, but the connection between war, captives, movement, and sickness is plausible enough to make the story grimly believable. The same imperial reach that brings glory also brings invisible disaster home. Syria gives the Hittites power. It also exposes them to dangers no chariot can charge down. Meanwhile, Assyria watches and grows. Once overshadowed by Mitanni, Assyria begins to reassert itself as Mitanni weakens. This creates a new eastern pressure on the Hittite world. The Hittites may defeat one rival only to help create room for another. Babylon remains a prestigious power, though not always a direct military threat to Hatti. Egypt continues to guard its northern interests. Smaller kingdoms maneuver constantly, shifting loyalty when they sense opportunity. The late Bronze Age system looks grand from a distance, with its great kings and splendid gifts. But from inside it is nervous, competitive, and prone to cascading crisis. Hatti's position between giants is therefore both magnificent and perilous. It has become strong enough to speak as an equal with Egypt, to dominate northern Syria, to break Mitanni, and to command loyalty from many lesser rulers. But its empire is stretched across difficult terrain and unstable frontiers. To the south, Egyptian ambition remains. To the east, Assyria grows sharper. In the west, Anatolian lands can be restless. At home, plague and succession anxieties never entirely vanish. The Hittites have entered the high circle of Bronze Age power, but that circle is not a place of safety. It is a ring of watching kings, each smiling through formal greetings while measuring the weakness of the others. And so the road narrows toward confrontation. Syria, rich and contested, becomes the place where imperial language must eventually give way to marching feet. The Hittites have built a system of vassals and fortresses there. Egypt cannot accept endless Hittite expansion without losing face and influence. Cities caught between them learn to read the winds of power carefully, because choosing wrongly can mean ruin. The storm that began in the highlands of Anatolia now gathers over the Levant. And somewhere ahead, near the Orontes River, the name Kadesh waits. Syria is the kind of prize that looks smaller on a map than it feels in the hands of kings. To Egypt, it is the northern shield, the corridor through which threats may approach and wealth may flow. To the Hittites, it is the southern extension of imperial power, the place where highland authority becomes international dominance. To the cities of Syria themselves, it is home a world of walls, temples, markets, fields, caravans, scribes, local dynasties, and old loyalties complicated by the arrival of larger empires. The tragedy of Syria in the late Bronze Age is that it lies exactly where ambition converges. It is too valuable to be ignored, too divided to resist every outside pressure, and too strategic to remain neutral for long. The Hittite advance into northern Syria does not simply create a frontier, it creates a zone of constant testing. Cities such as Aleppo, Carchemish, Ugarit, Amuru, and Kadesh become pieces in a political game whose rules are written by force and oath. Some are directly controlled, some are ruled by local dynasts under Hittite oversight, and some maneuver between empires with the anxious flexibility of states that know geography has not been kind to them. A Syrian ruler may swear loyalty to Hatti because Hittite armies are near, then look toward Egypt if Hittite attention weakens. He may send tribute south while promising obedience north. He may calculate that survival depends less on honour than timing. In imperial records, this appears as treachery. In local reality, it may have felt like the only way to keep a city alive. Kadesh stands near the centre of this tightening struggle. Its location on the Orontes River gives it significance beyond its walls. It controls routes through inland Syria and sits in a zone where Egyptian and Hittite influence collide. A power that holds Kadesh can threaten the ambitions of the other. For Egypt, losing or failing to secure Kadesh means accepting that the northern Levant is slipping beyond pharaonic reach. For Hatti, holding Kadesh helps anchor the southern edge of its Syrian system. The city becomes more than a city. It becomes a symbol of whether Egypt can still project power northward and whether the Hittites can make their Syrian empire endure. The Egyptian kings before Ramesses II had already campaigned in the Levant, and Egypt's imperial presence there has a long history. During the New Kingdom, Egypt uses garrisons, client rulers, tribute systems, and military expeditions to maintain influence across Canaan and parts of Syria. Egyptian power is not always direct in the modern sense. It is often layered through local princes who remain in place but are expected to obey, send goods, and support Egyptian interests. This resembles Hittite practice in some ways, though the ideological language differs. Both empires depend on local rulers, both distrust them, both need them. That is one of the quiet ironies of late Bronze Age imperialism. The great kings speak as if they command the earth, but they constantly depend on smaller kings whose loyalty must be renewed, watched, and sometimes punished. Amuru offers a vivid example of this unstable world. Located between major spheres of influence, it becomes a political hinge in the struggle between Egypt and Hatti. Its rulers shift alignments, and their choices reverberate far beyond their own territory. When Amuru leans toward the Hittites, Egypt sees not just a local defection, but a strategic insult. When Egypt tries to recover influence, the Hittites see a challenge to their vassal network. The evidence remains incomplete in places, and the motives of local rulers can be hard to reconstruct through imperial documents that often portray them as faithless. But their behaviour makes sense in a world where a small kingdom survives by reading the balance of fear. A wrong choice may bring an army to the gates, a delayed choice may bring two. Under Ramesses II, Egypt's desire to reassert control in Syria becomes inseparable from royal image. Ramesses is young, ambitious, and determined to present himself as the kind of pharaoh who restores strength where others have allowed decline. Egyptian kingship is built on the idea of order over chaos, and foreign lands are often portrayed as places that must be subdued so cosmic balance can be maintained. But beneath the sacred language lies a practical concern. If Hittite power dominates too much of Syria, Egypt's prestige suffers, its northern buffer weakens, and its local allies may lose confidence. An empire does not only lose territory when its rivals advance, it loses credibility, and credibility, in a vassal world, is a form of currency. The Hittite king facing Egypt in this period is Muwatalli II, a ruler who understands the stakes clearly. He is not defending a distant ornament, he is defending the southern architecture of Hittite power. Muwatalli even moves the royal seat for a time from Hattusa to Tahuntasser in southern Anatolia, a decision that remains partly debated but may reflect strategic, religious, or political concerns connected with the empire's southern focus. This is a lesser known but revealing detail. The Hittite state is not frozen around one capital in a simple way. Its centre of gravity can shift under pressure. The move suggests a kingdom adapting to the demands of empire, perhaps positioning royal authority closer to the regions where conflict with Egypt and control of Syria matter most. Such a move also hints at internal complexity. Hattusa remains symbolically powerful, but royal decisions must answer to military realities, religious obligations, and regional politics. Muwatalli's reign occurs in a world where Hatti must watch Egypt to the south, Assyria to the east, and Anatolian politics closer to home. The king cannot afford to treat Syria as a side issue. It is the front line of great power status. If he loses it, Hittite prestige may unravel. If he holds it, Egypt must reckon with Hatti as an equal. As both powers prepare, the road to Kadesh becomes a road of information as much as movement. Ancient warfare depends heavily on knowing where the enemy is, how fast he is moving, which allies have arrived, and whether local rulers are loyal or pretending. Scouts, spies, captured messengers, and false reports can matter as much as spears. The famous Egyptian account of Kadesh emphasizes deception. Rameses is misled by men who claim the Hittite army is far away, when in fact it is hidden much closer. Whether every detail is shaped by royal storytelling or preserves real battlefield intelligence, the theme is believable. In Syria, where loyalties are layered and roads are watched by many eyes, information itself becomes a weapon. The armies gathering for the confrontation are not simple national forces in the modern sense. Rameses marches with divisions named after gods, supported by the machinery of Egyptian campaigning. Muwatalli assembles a coalition drawing on Hittite troops and many allied or vassal contingents from across his sphere. This coalition is itself a message. The Hittite king is not alone. He can summon many lands under his command, at least for this decisive moment. But coalition armies are complicated instruments. Their size impresses. Their coordination tests the skill of command. They must be fed, placed, directed, and kept committed to the same goal. Kadesh therefore becomes inevitable, not because either side is irrational, but because both are acting according to the logic of empire. Egypt cannot allow its northern influence to appear permanently broken. Hatti cannot allow its Syrian system to be peeled apart. Local kingdoms cannot escape the pressure of choosing. Royal pride, strategic geography, treaty obligations, economic roots, and the memory of earlier campaigns all press toward the same point. No single explanation fully accounts for the collision, because the collision is made of many causes layered together over decades. On the eve of battle, the Orontes landscape holds more than soldiers. It holds the tension of an entire age. Chariot horses wait under harness, infantry gather with shields and spears, commanders depend on reports that may be false. Vassal rulers watch the strength of the kings they have chosen to follow. Rameses carries the burden of Egyptian kingship and its need for visible triumph. Muwatalli carries the burden of Hittite Empire and its need to prove that Syria will not be surrendered. The city of Kadesh stands nearby, silent behind its walls, while two great powers prepare to turn a frontier dispute into one of the most famous battles ever carved into stone. Kadesh begins in uncertainty, which is fitting, because almost everything remembered about the battle comes to us through a struggle over truth. The Egyptian version is loud, monumental, and determined. It appears on temple walls in multiple places, shaped into relief and inscription, with Rameses II at the blazing centre of events. The Hittite version is quieter, more broken, less theatrically preserved. Between them lies the historian's problem. One of the most famous battles of the ancient world is also one of the most difficult to see clearly. It is not hidden because nothing was written. It is hidden because what was written had a purpose. Royal history does not simply record power, it performs it. Rameses marches north toward Kadesh with an army divided into major divisions, each bearing the name of a god. In the Egyptian telling, the pharaoh advances ahead with the division of a moon, while the rest of the force stretches behind him along the road. This alone creates danger. An army on the move is not yet an army ready for battle. Its parts can become separated by distance, terrain, dust, and confusion. The king may believe he knows where the enemy is. But knowledge in ancient warfare is fragile. Scouts can fail, captives can lie, local informants can serve two masters, messages can arrive late. The difference between confidence and disaster may be a few miles of mistaken information. The Egyptian account says that two men, presented as Shasu nomads, are captured or encountered and claim that the Hittite king is far to the north, afraid of Rameses and unwilling to fight. This report encourages the pharaoh to continue forward. Later, other captured scouts reveal the opposite Muwatalli, and the Hittite army are not far away at all. They are hidden behind Kadesh, close enough to strike. The scene has the shape of a trap. And whether the details are polished by Egyptian narrative craft or preserve a genuine intelligence failure, the basic situation is plausible. Rameses has moved into danger before his full army is concentrated. Muwatalli has waited, concealed, and chosen his moment. Then the Hittite chariots come. They cross the Orontes and crash into the Egyptian division of Re, which is still approaching and not properly prepared for the blow. In the Egyptian reliefs, the Hittite attack is dramatic, violent, and nearly overwhelming. Chariots break through, men scatter. The order of march collapses into panic. This is the kind of moment every Bronze Age commander fears, not a slow contest between formed lines, but a sudden strike against an exposed part of an army before the rest can help. The Hittites, often understood as using heavier chariots with crews suited for shock action, exploit the opening with terrifying force. For a brief time, the Egyptian campaign appears to be unravelling. Rameses is left in extreme danger, at least according to his own story. The royal inscriptions place him almost alone, surrounded by enemies, abandoned by troops, calling upon Amun, and then fighting with superhuman courage. The image is pure pharaonic theatre, the king as the single pillar holding the world upright when ordinary men fail. On temple walls, Rameses towers over the battlefield, his bow drawn, his horses charging, enemy bodies collapsing around him. It is not subtle. It is not meant to be. The message is that the king's divine power transforms disaster into triumph. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, there may be a real crisis. Royal propaganda often inflates victory, but it does not usually invent humiliating danger without reason. The fact that the Egyptian account admits confusion, deception, panic, and near catastrophe suggests that something genuinely went wrong. Rameses may have performed bravely, his personal guard, elite troops, and arriving reinforcements may have helped stabilize the situation. A group often called the Anerin appears in the Egyptian record as a force arriving at a crucial moment. Though scholars still debate exactly who they were, where they came from, and how they fit into the battle, their appearance is one of those details that opens a window and then clouds it. What survives in the record suggests that Rameses was not saved by divine courage alone. He was saved by timing, support, and the failure of the Hittites to turn the initial shock into total destruction. That failure is important. After breaking into the Egyptian camp, some Hittite chariot forces may have become distracted by plunder. This detail appears in the Egyptian narrative and may serve to mock the enemy. But it is also believable in the chaos of ancient battle. A camp full of wealth, equipment, animals, and supplies is a powerful temptation. If the attacking chariots lose formation and momentum, their first success can become a trap of its own. Chariots are frightening when coordinated. They are vulnerable when scattered among tents, baggage, and regrouping defenders. The Egyptian forces recover enough to counterattack, and the battle becomes less a clean Hittite ambush than a brutal, confused struggle around the camp and river. Muwatalli himself seems not to have committed all his infantry at the decisive moment. At least according to the Egyptian portrayal, why remains debated. Perhaps the terrain, timing, command structure, or confidence in the chariot strike shaped his decision. Perhaps the Egyptian account distorts events to make the Hittite king appear cowardly or passive. Perhaps Muwatalli's broader goal was not annihilation but containment. The evidence remains incomplete. What can be said is that the Hittite attack does not destroy Rameses, and Rameses does not destroy the Hittite army. Both sides survive the day, both retain enough strength to claim something afterward. The Egyptian inscriptions present Kadesh as a magnificent victory, but the political aftermath refuses to obey that version completely. Kadesh itself does not become a secure Egyptian possession. Hittite influence in Syria remains strong. Rameses does not sweep north and break Hatti's power. Muwatalli does not lose his empire. The battle looks, from a colder strategic angle, less like an Egyptian triumph than a bloody check on Egyptian ambition. At most, Rameses survives a dangerous situation and prevents disaster from becoming ruin. That is no small achievement. Survival under such circumstances can be turned into glory by a skilled royal machine, but it is not the same as conquest. This is why Kadesh has often been called a battle of two truths. There is the truth carved by Rameses, the divine king alone against chaos, victorious by courage and favour. There is the truth suggested by geopolitics. Egypt fails to dislodge the Hittite position in Syria. There is also a third truth, quieter and perhaps more human. Thousands of men and horses are thrown into terror, because two imperial systems cannot accept uncertainty along a frontier. The men who die at Kadesh are not symbols. They are drivers, shield-bearers, archers, infantrymen, grooms, messengers, camp workers, and vassal troops drawn into a conflict larger than their own names. For the Hittites, Kadesh proves that Egypt can be resisted. For Egypt, Kadesh proves that Hatti cannot be ignored or easily crushed, that mutual recognition may be the battle's most important result. The pharaoh can cover temple walls with victory scenes, and the Hittite king can maintain his Syrian network, but both powers have learned something severe. The other side is not a passing nuisance. It is a great kingdom with organisation, courage, resources, and reach. The road to absolute victory is blocked. So Kadesh remains suspended between monument and reality. It is remembered because Rameses made it unforgettable, but its deeper meaning lies in what his monuments try hardest to control. The battle reveals the limits of royal power even while celebrating it. It shows how quickly an army can fall into danger, how much depends on information, how difficult it is to convert battlefield success into lasting political change, and how propaganda can preserve a crisis as if it were a triumph. The Hittites do not vanish from the field, Egypt does not reclaim the north. The Orontes continues to flow past Kadesh, indifferent to inscriptions, while the two empires look at one another across Syria with a new and wary respect. After Kadesh, the world does not settle into the shape Ramesses carves on his temples. Stone can declare triumph, but borders answer more slowly. The Hittites remain in Syria. Egypt remains powerful, proud, and unwilling to confess frustration. Kadesh itself, the city whose name becomes attached to the great drama, does not become the firm Egyptian prize that a simple victory should have delivered. Instead, the battle leaves behind something more complicated. A hardening of respect between rivals who have tested each other at the edge of catastrophe and discovered that neither can easily destroy the other. This is one of the most important consequences of the battle. Fear does not always mean panic. Sometimes it means recognition. Egypt fears the Hittites because Hatti has proven that it can gather a vast coalition, hide its strength, strike with devastating force and hold its position afterward. The Hittites fear Egypt in a different but equally serious way, because Ramesses has shown that even a near disaster can be absorbed by Egyptian resilience, royal charisma, and the enormous resources of the Nile Kingdom. Each side sees the other more clearly after Kadesh. The old fantasy of effortless domination becomes harder to sustain, even if official monuments continue to speak in the language of total victory. For Ramesses, the immediate problem is image. Egyptian kingship cannot comfortably present a campaign that nearly collapses into defeat. The pharaoh is the guarantor of order, the chosen of the gods, the one who subdues foreign lands and keeps chaos beyond Egypt's borders. So Kadesh must become a story in which danger magnifies glory. The greater the crisis, the greater the king, the more isolated he appears, the more divine his survival becomes. The inscriptions and reliefs do not hide the ambush, they transform it. Confusion becomes the stage for heroism. Military vulnerability becomes proof that Ramesses alone possesses the strength of many. This is propaganda, but not meaningless propaganda. It reveals what the Egyptian court needed the battle to mean. The Hittites, by contrast, do not leave the same kind of grand visual record of Kadesh. Their silence is not proof that they lost. It reflects different habits of commemoration and the uneven survival of evidence. Hittite records often preserve treaties, annals, prayers, instructions, and diplomatic material rather than vast temple wall battle narratives in the Egyptian style. What survives in the record suggests that the strategic reality after Kadesh favours Hatti, more than Ramesses would like his audience to believe. The Syrian balance does not swing decisively back to Egypt. The Hittite system of vassal kingdoms remains dangerous and intact. That is why the aftermath matters more than the shouting of monuments. In the years after the battle, Egypt continues campaigning in the Levant. Ramesses does not simply retreat into ceremonial memory. He tries to recover influence, pressure rebellious or contested regions, and maintain the appearance and substance of imperial reach. Some campaigns may bring successes in Canaan and parts of the southern Levant, where Egyptian authority is more deeply rooted, but pushing into the northern Syrian zone controlled or influenced by Hatti remains another matter. The farther Egypt moves from the Nile, the more difficult the logistics become, and the closer it comes to Hittite strength. The empire can strike, punish, and display power, but holding the far north securely is a harder achievement. For the Hittites, the aftermath of Kadesh is not effortless either. Muwatalli II has protected the Syrian system, but he rules an empire with its own internal strains. His relocation of the royal seat to Tarantassa, while likely connected to a mixture of strategic, religious and political motives, creates complications that later echo through succession and regional authority. Hattusa remains a sacred and administrative heartland, but the royal centre has shifted in ways that may unsettle elite expectations. After Muwatalli's death, the throne passes into a tense succession environment, involving his son Urhi-Teshub, who rules as Musili III, and his uncle Hattusili III. The resulting conflict is not a minor family quarrel. It shows again that Hittite power, however formidable abroad, can be endangered by dynastic fracture at home. Hattusili III eventually seizes the throne, justifying his actions through texts that present his rise as legitimate and divinely favoured. As always, the record must be read carefully. A usurper with scribes is still a usurper, even if he explains himself elegantly. But the episode reveals a recurring Hittite pattern. Royal authority must be narrated, defended and sanctified. The gods are invoked, past wrongs are explained. Political necessity is dressed in the language of justice. Scholars still debate aspects of the succession and the political networks behind it, but the broader point is clear. The empire that frightened Egypt is not internally unbreakable. Its kings can be challenged by their own kin, and legitimacy remains something that must be actively maintained. This internal tension helps explain why diplomacy becomes increasingly valuable. Open war between Egypt and Hatti is expensive, risky, and indecisive. Both powers have other concerns. Egypt must manage its southern and western frontiers, its internal religious and building programs, and the demands of ruling a vast kingdom. Hatti must watch Assyria, restless Anatolian territories, Syrian vassals, and its own dynastic politics. Neither empire can afford endless full-scale war over every contested city. The logic of confrontation begins to give way to the logic of stabilization. Not friendship, exactly. Something colder and more durable mutual advantage. The Hittite threat remains real precisely because it becomes diplomatic as well as military. A barbarian enemy can be portrayed as chaos, An equal rival must be managed through letters, gifts, treaties, and marriages. That shift may seem less dramatic than chariot charges, but it is profound. Egypt's willingness to treat Hatti as a peer says more than any boast carved after Kadesh. The pharaoh's court could continue to show Ramesses crushing foreigners in art, but in practice it had to speak to the Hittite king in the language reserved for great powers. The Hittites had forced themselves into Egypt's diplomatic imagination. The Syrian cities feel this change directly. For them, the difference between war and diplomacy is not abstract. It determines whether armies march through fields, whether tribute goes north or south, whether a local dynasty survives, whether hostages are demanded, whether walls are repaired in fear of siege. A treaty between great kings may bring relief, but it also freezes certain realities in place. If a city lies under Hittite authority, Egyptian recognition may confirm that status. If a ruler hoped to switch sides, the narrowing space between empires may become a trap. Peace among giants does not always mean freedom for those standing beneath them. There is a subtle irony in the aftermath of Kadesh. Ramesses becomes one of the most famous warrior pharaohs partly because he turns an indecisive and dangerous battle into a masterpiece of royal storytelling. The Hittites become one of Egypt's most serious rivals partly because they do not need the same kind of monumental self-advertisement to prove their strength. Their success is written in the map, in the persistence of their Syrian system, and in the fact that Egypt eventually negotiates. The battle's real legacy is not a pile of enemy bodies or a captured capital. It is the recognition of limits. This recognition does not arrive all at once. It hardens slowly through campaigns, letters, succession struggles, and the steady pressure of other threats. Assyria's growing power in the east matters. So do the internal demands of Hittite rule. So does the practical wisdom of rulers who understand that glory can become exhaustion if pursued too far. No single explanation fully accounts for the move from rivalry to peace. It is the product of battlefield experience, diplomatic realism, political need, and the simple fact that neither side can make the other disappear. The fear Egypt feels after Kadesh is therefore not the fear of a defeated kingdom trembling before invaders. It is the fear of equality. Hatti has become too strong to dismiss, too organised to crush, and too important to ignore. From the rocky heart of Anatolia, the Hittites have forced the Nile's greatest monarchy to accept a new reality. The world is not arranged around Egypt alone. Beyond the deserts, beyond Canaan, beyond the contested cities of Syria, another great king sits beneath his own gods, commands his own armies, writes his own letters, and expects to be answered as a brother. The peace between Egypt and Hatti does not feel like the peace of friends. It feels like the peace of exhausted giants who have measured the cost of continuing and found it heavier than pride alone can carry. By the time the famous treaty takes shape, years have passed since Kadesh, and the world around both empires has shifted. Muwatalli II is gone. Hattusili III now holds the Hittite throne after a contested rise that needs careful justification. Ramesses II remains in Egypt, older, grander, and increasingly invested in presenting his reign as an age of unmatched stability and splendour. Both kings understand something their monuments do not always admit. A strong enemy can be more useful as a recognised partner than as an endless wound along the frontier. The treaty between Ramesses II and Hattusili III is often described as one of the earliest surviving international peace treaties, and its survival in both Egyptian and Hittite versions gives it extraordinary importance. It is not a modern treaty in spirit, though modern eyes often want to make it one. It is a Bronze Age agreement wrapped in sacred language, dynastic concern, political necessity, and mutual suspicion. It does not emerge from idealism, it emerges from calculation. Egypt and Hatti do not suddenly decide that war is immoral. They decide that this war, under these conditions, no longer serves them well enough. The terms reveal the anxieties beneath the ceremony. The two kings promise peace and brotherhood, but they also address defence, succession, fugitives, and mutual aid. If enemies threaten one party, the other is expected to assist. If political fugitives flee across borders, they are to be returned. If the Hittite king's line faces trouble, Egyptian recognition matters. This is especially important for Hattusili, whose seizure of power from his nephew leaves a shadow over his legitimacy. A treaty with Ramesses does more than calm a frontier. It helps confirm Hattusili's standing before the international world. Recognition by Egypt is a kind of diplomatic armour. This is a lesser-known but crucial side of the treaty. It is not only about ending war after Kadesh, it is also about stabilising Hattusili's throne. The Hittite king needs Egypt not because he is weak in the simple sense, but because usurpation creates memory, and memory creates danger. A rival claimant can become a focus for rebellion. Foreign courts can shelter or exploit displaced figures. A disputed king benefits when another great king treats him as legitimate. In this way, the treaty reaches beyond armies and cities. It enters the private fear of dynasties, the fear that someone with blood, grievance, and support might return. For Ramesses, the treaty offers its own rewards. It helps secure the northern sphere without requiring endless costly campaigns into regions Egypt cannot easily dominate. It allows the pharaoh to preserve his image of strength while accepting a diplomatic reality that protects Egyptian interests. In Egyptian presentation, peace can be framed as the submission or goodwill of a foreign ruler impressed by pharaonic greatness. In practical terms, it gives Egypt a stable relationship with the one power strong enough to contest its Levantine ambitions directly. A pharaoh does not have to confess equality in temple art for equality to operate in diplomatic practice. The treaty is sealed not only by royal words but by divine witnesses. The gods of both lands are invoked, and curses stand behind the promises. The agreement is not merely political, it is cosmic. To break it is to invite the anger of gods who govern mountains, rivers, heaven, earth, storm, sun, and the hidden forces that watch human oaths. This sacred enforcement matters because there is no international court, no neutral authority, no institution above the kings. The gods are the guarantors because only gods are imagined as powerful enough to punish across borders when armies are absent. The treaty's solemnity is therefore also a sign of how fragile trust really is. The existence of two versions, one preserved in Egyptian monumental form and another known from Hittite archives, is one of the great gifts of ancient history. It lets us see the same diplomatic event from two political worlds. The versions are not identical in every phrasing, and each belongs to its own cultural setting, but together they confirm that this was not a fantasy of one side. Egypt and Hatti truly did make peace. The pharaoh who had carved his personal rescue at Kadesh into stone now enters a formal brotherhood with the people his reliefs present as defeated enemies. The contradiction is not accidental. It is how empires survive their own propaganda. Peace also opens the way for royal marriage. Years after the treaty, a Hittite princess is sent to Egypt to marry Rameses II. Her journey is more than a family arrangement. It is a moving symbol of the new order, a human bridge between courts that once met in chariot smoke. The princess travels from the Hittite world into Egypt's ceremonial universe, where she receives an Egyptian name and becomes part of the pharaoh's household. For Hatti, the marriage confirms prestige. A daughter of the Hittite king enters the house of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. For Egypt, the marriage can be displayed as a tribute-like act, folded into Ramesses' vision of universal honour flowing toward him. Both sides can interpret the same event in ways that flatter themselves. Behind the grandeur, the personal reality of such a marriage is almost impossible to recover. The princess becomes visible as a diplomatic figure, but her own experience remains mostly silent. She leaves one court for another, one language world for another, one religious landscape for another. She carries with her the weight of peace, alliance, and royal expectation. What survives in the record suggests ceremony and status, but not the inner life of the woman at the centre of the arrangement. Ancient diplomacy often turns bodies into guarantees, especially the bodies of royal women. They move where treaties need flesh. Letters between the courts reveal a more textured relationship after peace. There are exchanges of gifts, requests, complaints, negotiations over marriage, and concerns over health and status. Gold, so abundant in Egyptian ideology and so desired by foreign courts, remains a recurring subject in late Bronze Age diplomacy. Kings ask, flatter, complain, and remind one another of obligations. The language may be formal, but the emotions beneath it can feel familiar. Suspicion over whether enough has been sent, irritation at delays, anxiety over rank, insistence that brotherhood must be shown materially. The world of great kings is ceremonial, but it is also petty in the way only high politics can be petty. The peace does not erase all problems. It freezes some and redirects others. Syria remains divided into spheres of influence, and local rulers still must live with imperial oversight. Assyria continues to rise in the east, becoming a more serious concern for Hatti. Internal Hittite politics do not become simple merely because Egypt has recognised Hattusili. The treaty is a powerful achievement, but not a magical cure. No single agreement can remove the structural pressures of the late Bronze Age. It can only manage them for a time. Still, that time matters. For a while, the Eastern Mediterranean breathes differently. The two powers that once collided at Kadesh now exchange formal assurances. Their kings call one another brother not as empty politeness, but as part of a deliberate architecture of stability. Roads remain dangerous, vassals remain uncertain, gods remain demanding, and ambitions remain alive. Yet the great confrontation between Egypt and Hatti no longer dominates every calculation. Diplomacy has done what battle could not. It has created a livable boundary between pride and necessity. The treaty's deeper significance lies in what it reveals about Hittite status. Egypt does not make such an agreement with a minor enemy. It does not bind itself in sacred brotherhood with a passing nuisance. Hatti has forced recognition. The warriors from Anatolia have become diplomats of the highest rank, and their king stands in written equality with the pharaoh. This is the answer to the question of why they terrified Egypt. Not because they burned Egyptian cities or conquered the Nile, but because they made Egypt accept limits. They made the pharaoh's world larger than Egyptian ideology preferred. They proved that beyond the northern horizon stood another order, another royal house, another set of gods, and another empire strong enough to demand peace on its own terms. Peace with Egypt gives the Hittite Empire room to breathe, but breathing is not the same as healing. Beneath the surface of royal treaties, marriage alliances, and formal brotherhood, the great kingdom of Hatti carries stresses that no single diplomatic success can remove. The empire has become large, prestigious, and feared, yet its size is itself a problem. It stretches across hard country, restless frontiers, old rival regions, sacred obligations, and vassal states whose loyalty depends on confidence in the centre. When the centre looks strong, obedience can appear natural. When the centre weakens, every oath begins to feel negotiable. The first crack is dynastic, because in Hittite history the royal family is often both the engine of power and the blade pointed at its heart. Hattusili III, the king who makes peace with Rameses, does not come to the throne through a clean and uncontested line. He removes his nephew, Uri-Teshub, who had ruled as Musili III, and then spends considerable effort explaining why this was justified. In his own telling, the gods support him, his nephew behaves wrongly, and his own rise appears as necessity rather than ambition. That may contain elements of truth, but royal self-defense is never neutral. What matters is that the empire's legitimacy has to be argued. A king whose right is obvious does not need so much explanation. This problem does not vanish after Hattusili takes power. Displaced claimants, rival branches, and regional bases of authority remain dangerous. Tarhuntassa, the southern royal seat associated with Muwatalli II, becomes especially important in this wider pattern. The exact political history of Tarhuntassa is difficult to reconstruct, and scholars still debate many details, but it appears as a major centre with its own royal connections and potential to complicate the unity of Hatti. The Hittite world is not a simple pyramid with Hattusa forever at the top and everyone else quietly beneath it. It contains competing centres, inherited privileges, local elites, and memories of who once ruled from where. The second crack is imperial overextension. The Hittites do not rule a compact state with easy internal communication. Their authority reaches through central Anatolia into northern Syria, across lands with different languages, traditions, economies, and political habits. Holding such a world together requires constant movement of orders, messengers, troops, tribute, and ritual attention. Every distant vassal is a possible problem. Every frontier needs watching. Every royal death invites recalculation. The treaty with Egypt may stabilise the southwest Syrian question, but it does not reduce the entire empire to calm. It merely removes one major fire while others continue to smoulder. Assyria becomes one of those fires. In earlier generations, Mitanni had served as a major buffer and rival in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, but Mitanni's weakening, partly accelerated by Hittite action, allows Assyria to rise into a far more aggressive power. This creates a cruel strategic irony. Hatti helps break one enemy, and then must face the consequences of a stronger one emerging in the east. Assyria's expansion threatens Hittite interests in northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia, forcing Hatti to defend a long and difficult frontier against a kingdom with its own military traditions and ambitions. The Hittites remain powerful, but they are no longer operating in a world where Egypt is the only great rival that matters. The third crack is environmental and economic pressure. Ancient texts from the later Hittite period and from neighbouring regions point toward shortages, grain concerns, and requests for food. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is dangerous to turn every ancient collapse into a simple story of drought, but climate stress and famine likely formed part of the wider crisis of the Late Bronze Age. Tree ring studies and other paleoclimate research have suggested episodes of severe dryness in parts of Anatolia around the time of the Hittite collapse, though scholars continue to refine the chronology and significance. What can be said with confidence is that a state like Hatti depends heavily on predictable agricultural extraction. If harvests fail repeatedly, the pressure spreads quickly through the system. Famine does not only mean hunger among peasants, it means fewer surplus stores for temples, armies, palace workers, and emergency reserves. It means difficulty feeding horses, maintaining garrisons, rewarding officials, and supplying campaigns. It can make vassals more rebellious because the centre has less to give and more to demand. It can make ordinary communities more desperate and less willing to support distant imperial projects. It can turn roads into routes of flight rather than trade. No single explanation fully accounts for the weakening of the Hittite Empire, but food stress is the kind of pressure that makes every other problem sharper. Plague had already shown how invisible forces could wound Hatti from within. Earlier epidemics under Suppiluliuma I and Musili II had killed kings and weakened the land for years. Even if later crises were not direct continuations of that same disease, the memory of plague reveals the vulnerability of a Bronze Age empire to biological disaster. Armies move people, captives move pathogens, trade routes move more than goods. A king may win a campaign and bring home sickness as part of the spoils. In Hittite thought, such disaster demands religious explanation, but in practical terms it also means labour loss, military disruption, and fear. The fourth crack is the vassal system itself. Hittite imperial rule depends on local kings bound by oath. This is efficient because it allows Hatti to govern wide regions without replacing every local structure. But efficiency carries risk. A vassal king remains a king. He has his own court, his own ambitions, his own resentments, and his own sense of survival. If Hittite armies are near, he obeys. If Assyria presses from one direction, Egypt tempts from another. While the Hittite throne looks uncertain, he may reconsider. Treaties list curses because betrayal is expected enough to require supernatural terror. The very weight of those curses shows how fragile obedience can be. In western Anatolia, the picture is even more difficult because the evidence is fragmentary and often debated. Hittite texts refer to lands and powers such as Arzawa, Ahiawa, Wilusa, and others, opening the possibility of connections with the wider Aegean world. Ahiawa is frequently linked by scholars to Mycenaean Greeks, though exact political geography remains disputed. These Western concerns remind us that Hatti faces not one frontier but many. While Syria draws attention because of Egypt, the West can drain resources and create uncertainty. The Hittite king must look in several directions at once, and no human ruler can stare everywhere forever. All of these pressures accumulate quietly before catastrophe becomes visible. Empires rarely collapse because one wall cracks on one day. They weaken through repeated strain, a succession dispute here, a failed harvest there, a rebellious vassal, a costly campaign, a rival rising, a ritual obligation neglected, a court faction waiting, a shipment delayed, a road unsafe, a city less afraid than it used to be. Each problem alone may be survivable. Together, they change the atmosphere. People begin to sense that the centre cannot answer every challenge. Once that belief spreads, power itself changes texture. Late Hittite kings still rule, command, write, and worship. The empire does not simply fall asleep. Tudhaliya IV, Suppiluliuma II, and others continue to act with ambition, building, campaigning, and attempting to hold the state together. Izalikaya's sacred carvings and later royal projects show that Hittite ideological life remains intense. The final kings are not shadows wandering through ruins. They are rulers fighting the narrowing options of their age. What survives in the record suggests effort, not passivity. Yet effort is not always enough. The treaty with Egypt had marked the height of Hittite recognition, the moment when the pharaoh accepted Hatti as a brother. But recognition by a foreign king cannot guarantee reign, prevent disease, secure every vassal, silence every claimant, or stop Assyria from rising. The empire that once terrified Egypt now faces a more frightening enemy, the slow convergence of pressures that cannot be defeated in a single battle. The cracks beneath the great kingdom widen not with one thunderclap, but with the grinding patience of history itself. The end of Hattusa does not arrive in the record as a clean, dramatic sentence. There is no surviving Hittite tablet that calmly explains the last day of the capital, no royal inscription saying that the gates have failed, the gods have departed, and the great kingdom is over. Instead, the city leaves a more troubling kind of evidence: abandonment, destruction, broken archives, burned buildings, empty spaces where power had once been concentrated, and a silence that grows louder precisely because the Hittites have been such careful writers. A civilization that recorded rituals, treaties, prayers, inventories, and royal anxieties does not record its own disappearance in the same clear voice. The historian is left standing among ruins, trying to understand why a capital built to endure was no longer worth holding. Hattusa is burned, but burning alone does not explain collapse. Ancient cities burn for many reasons. They burn in enemy attacks, civil conflicts, accidental fires, ritual destructions, and abandonment followed by later occupation or looting. In Hattusa's case, archaeology suggests that parts of the city were destroyed by fire around the end of the Bronze Age, but the pattern is complicated. Some evidence indicates that the city may have been partly evacuated before its final destruction. Valuable objects and official personnel may already have been removed. This possibility changes the mood of the event. Instead of imagining only a sudden night of massacre, one must also imagine decisions made in advance, stores emptied, tablets left behind or moved, officials departing, sacred objects possibly relocated, families leaving streets that had once seemed permanent. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact sequence. Was Hattusa attacked by outside enemies after being weakened? Was it abandoned by the royal administration before hostile forces arrived? Did internal conflict play a role? Were the attackers local groups, Kaska peoples from the north, rivals from within the Hittite world, or part of wider movements associated with the upheavals sometimes called the Sea Peoples? No single explanation fully accounts for the fall. The old temptation is to find one destroyer, one invasion, one dramatic cause, but Hattusa's end looks more like the visible scar of a system that had already been failing in several places at once. The Kaska are often part of the discussion because they had long troubled the northern frontier of Hatti. They were not a single neatly organised empire, but groups from the Pontic mountain region who appear in Hittite texts as persistent enemies, raiders and occupiers of vulnerable territories. At times, they even threatened or occupied Hattusa in earlier periods, forcing Hittite kings to recover the city. Their presence reminds us that the capital's danger did not come only from glamorous great powers such as Egypt or Assyria. It also came from hard northern landscapes and peoples who resisted Hittite control generation after generation. If Hattusa weakened, the Kaska or similar groups may have seized the opportunity, but they are not a complete explanation by themselves. They are one pressure among many. The so-called Sea Peoples form another part of the wider Late Bronze Age collapse, especially in Egyptian records, where they appear as dangerous groups moving by land and sea, attacking or unsettling regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Their role in the fall of the Hittite Empire remains debated. It is tempting to imagine them sweeping into Anatolia and burning Hattusa, because dramatic invaders make a simple story, but the evidence does not support such a direct and easy picture. Some coastal and western regions of Anatolia may have been affected by wider migrations, raids, and disruptions. The Hittite world certainly collapses in the same broader era of upheaval that affects Mycenaean Greece, the Levant, Cyprus, and other regions. Yet linking every destruction layer to the same migrating enemy oversimplifies a crisis that likely involved climate stress, famine, internal political weakness, trade disruption, warfare, and local opportunism. Trade disruption may have been especially damaging because the Bronze Age world depended on networks. Bronze itself depends on copper and tin often travels across long distances. Luxury goods, diplomatic gifts, horses, grain shipments, textiles, and specialist knowledge move through routes that require trust and stability. When major states weaken, trade becomes more dangerous. When trade becomes dangerous, states lose access to materials and prestige goods. When states lose those, their ability to reward elites and maintain armies suffers. Collapse is therefore contagious. One failing kingdom can destabilize the routes another kingdom needs. The Hittites are not falling in isolation. They are part of a world whose connecting threads are fraying. Famine adds another shadow. Later Hittite and contemporary Near Eastern correspondence includes references to grain shipments and food concerns, and some evidence points towards severe drought in central Anatolia around the period of collapse. The exact relationship between climate and political failure remains debated, but a sequence of bad harvests would have been devastating for Hatti. A capital like Hattusa, with its temples, specialists, officials, and defensive population, depends on surplus brought from elsewhere. If grain runs short, the city becomes a mouth too large to feed, armies become harder to supply, horses become harder to maintain, vassals become harder to discipline, gods become harder to honour with proper offerings. Hunger can make an empire feel abandoned by both king and heaven. The last known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, appears in surviving texts as active, not helpless. He campaigns, claims naval victories around Cyprus, and tries to maintain royal authority. That detail matters because it prevents the collapse from becoming a story of simple decline into laziness or decadence. The final rulers are still fighting, they are still using the language of kingship, they still imagine the empire as something that can be defended. But activity at the top does not guarantee stability below. A king may win a battle and still lose the system that makes future battles possible. He may command loyalty on paper, while actual loyalty drains away across mountains and coastlands. The archives of Hattusa create a final irony. Clay tablets survive fire well when baked by destruction, so catastrophe preserves what ordinary time might have erased. The burning of the city helps deliver Hittite voices to the modern world, yet those voices mostly speak from before the final silence. They tell us how the kingdom functioned, feared, prayed, and commanded, but they do not fully narrate the moment when functioning ceased. It is like finding the papers of a government whose officers were abandoned just before the last crisis reached the door. One can imagine, cautiously, the capital in its final phase, storerooms no longer as full as they should be, officials uncertain where the king's authority truly rests, messengers arriving late or not at all, rituals performed with urgency, rumours of enemies on the roads, families aware that the city's great walls no longer mean what they once meant. This is inference, not recorded scene, but it fits the evidence of a state under compound stress. A city does not have to be stormed at its strongest to be destroyed. It only has to be reached after the reasons for defending it have begun to fail. When Hattusa burns, the world that made Kadesh possible is already breaking. The age of great chariot empires, brother kings, bronze networks, and palace archives is giving way to something more fragmented. Egypt survives but withdraws from much of its imperial reach. Mycenaean palaces fall. Cities in the Levant are destroyed or transformed. Assyria endures and later rises in new forms. Across the eastern Mediterranean, old certainties vanish. The Hittite Great Kingdom disappears from its capital, leaving behind successor states but not the same imperial centre. The most haunting part of Hattusa's fall is that it does not feel impossible. Its walls were massive, its kings prestigious, its gods numerous, its scribes diligent, its armies feared, and still the city was abandoned and burned. That is the lesson hidden in the ash. Civilizations do not collapse only when they are weak in every visible way. Sometimes they collapse when their systems become too strained, when too many assumptions fail together, when old solutions no longer match new pressures. Hattusa had been built to command a dangerous world. In the end, the danger became larger than the command. The fall of Hattusa is not the same as the death of everything Hittite. Empires can vanish from their capitals while pieces of their language, art, religion, political habits, and memory continue to live in smaller forms. After the Great Kingdom collapses, the map does not become empty. Across southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, new and old centres continue under rulers who inherit fragments of the Hittite world and reshape them for a changed age. These successor states are often called Neo-Hittite kingdoms, though that label is a modern convenience and does not capture the full mixture of peoples, languages, and identities involved. They are not simply the old empire reduced in size. They are survivors in the ruins, adapting Hittite traditions to a world where the old imperial centre has gone silent. Carchemish becomes one of the most important of these surviving centres. Long before the collapse, it had served as a crucial Hittite stronghold in Syria, often governed by members of the royal family. Its position near the Euphrates made it strategically valuable, a hinge between Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia. When Hattusa falls, Carchemish does not disappear in the same way. Instead, it preserves lines of authority and cultural memory that reach back into the imperial age. This is one reason the collapse of Hatti looks different when viewed from Syria. From the capital, it appears catastrophic. From some southern regions, it appears more like transformation. The Great Kingdom is gone, but certain royal houses, scribal habits, artistic forms, and political claims continue under new conditions. These Neo-Hittite and related Aramean kingdoms occupy a fragmented landscape. Names such as Carchemish, Melid, Gurgum, Kumu, Tabel, Quir, Hamath, and others appear in later records. each with its own local character and political situation. Some preserve strongly Anatolian or Luwian elements, others are deeply shaped by Aramaean culture. Many are hybrids, and that hybridity is the point. The world after the Bronze Age collapse is not a clean replacement of one people by another. It's a rearrangement. Populations move, languages spread, elites adopt new styles, old symbols are reused, and political authority becomes more regional. What survives in the record suggests that people did not understand themselves as living in a simple afterword to Hittite greatness. They were building new kingdoms from the materials available to them. One of the most visible continuities is the use of hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions. These signs, carved on stone monuments, seals, and public inscriptions, had existed alongside cuneiform traditions during the imperial period. But after the collapse, they become especially important for the successor states. They are visually striking, filled with human figures, animals, symbols, and signs arranged with monumental confidence. To modern eyes, they can look almost pictorial, but they carry language and royal messages. Their survival helps scholars understand that the cultural legacy of Hatti did not end with the burned archives of Hattusa. It moved into stone, into public monuments, into the claims of rulers who still wanted to present themselves as legitimate heirs of old greatness. The art of these kingdoms also preserves and transforms Hittite styles. Monumental reliefs show kings, gods, warriors, feasting scenes, processions, lions, sphinxes, and divine symbols. The storm god remains powerful. Royal figures still stand in poses of authority. Protective animals still guard entrances, yet the style changes as the centuries pass, absorbing Syrian, Assyrian, Aramaean, and local influences. The result is not a fossil, but a living artistic language. A gate lion in a Neo-Hittite city is not merely a memory of Hattusa, it is a new statement made in a harsher political world, where small kingdoms must impress neighbours, subjects, merchants, and increasingly the expanding power of Assyria. Assyria becomes the great shadow over these survivors. In the early first millennium before the Common Era, the Neo-Assyrian Empire expands with a military and administrative intensity that transforms the Near East. The small kingdoms of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia find themselves under pressure from a state more relentless than the old Late Bronze Age balance of brother kings. Assyrian kings demand tribute, loyalty, hostages, and submission. Rebellion can bring devastating punishment. In Assyrian inscriptions, the descendants and cultural heirs of the Hittite world appear not as equals but as targets, tributaries, rebels, or conquered rulers. The age when Hatti could speak to Egypt as a brother is gone, the new imperial language is colder. Yet these states are not helpless shadows. For generations, they maneuver, resist, submit, rebel, and negotiate. Some become wealthy from trade and strategic location. Some use fortifications, alliances, and tribute to survive. Some rulers present themselves with impressive titles and monumental building projects. Their courts may be smaller than Hattusa's, but they are not insignificant. They stand at crossroads where goods, armies, and ideas continue to move. They preserve local power in a world of rising imperial pressure. The evidence remains incomplete for many of these kingdoms, but enough survives to show that the Hittite legacy remained politically meaningful long after the Great Kingdom's fall. A surprising detail is that the name of the Hittites survives in a distorted way through the very peoples who outlived the empire. In later Assyrian and biblical contexts, the term Hatti or related labels can be applied broadly to regions of Syria and Anatolia, sometimes long after the imperial Hittite state has vanished. This can confuse modern readers, because the Hittites of later references are not always the same as the Bronze Age empire centered at Hattusa. But that confusion itself is revealing. The name had weight, it lingered on the landscape. Even after the capital burned, outsiders still associated parts of the North Syrian world with Hatti. Memory survived, though not always accurately. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms also help explain why the Hittites were both remembered and forgotten. They were remembered locally through names, monuments, and traditions. But the central story of the Great Kingdom faded because its language, archives, and capital no longer formed a continuous historical tradition accessible to later classical writers. Egypt remained visible through monuments that never vanished beneath the same kind of linguistic silence. Assyria and Babylon remained tied to later written traditions. But Hattusa became a ruin in the highlands, and the cuneiform tablets buried there could not speak until modern decipherment. The successor states kept fragments alive, but fragments do not always preserve the whole shape of the empire that produced them. In these fragments, however, there is a different kind of survival. A storm god carved in stone, a lion guarding a city gate, a royal inscription in hieroglyphic Luwian, a title claiming descent or authority. A political centre like Carchemish enduring after Hattusa's silence each is a trace of continuity through catastrophe. The people of the post-Hittite world do not live in an empty aftermath. They inherit a broken but usable past. They take symbols that once belonged to a great empire and fit them to smaller kingdoms facing new dangers. Eventually, many of these states are absorbed into the Assyrian imperial system. Their independence narrows, then disappears. Their royal monuments become archaeological remains. Their inscriptions become puzzles. The gods lose temples or change names under new regimes. But the survival of these kingdoms delays the full disappearance of Hittite culture by centuries. They carry the old world across the threshold from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, not unchanged, not whole. but recognizable in flashes. The image that remains is not simply one of ruin, it is of embers carried from a burned city into other lands. Hattusa falls, but Carchemish stands. The great king is gone, but smaller kings still carve themselves beside gods. The archives are silent, but stones speak in another script. The empire that terrified Egypt does not continue as an empire, yet it refuses to vanish all at once. Its survivors live among altered borders, new languages, and harsher empires, keeping pieces of Hatti alive until even those pieces are buried and forgotten, waiting for another age to learn how to read them. For centuries, the Hittites remain hidden in plain sight. Their stones lie under Anatolian weather, their tablets sleep in broken archives, their name survives in scattered references that later readers do not fully understand. Egypt still speaks loudly through temples and tombs. Assyria still terrifies through carved palace walls and royal inscriptions. Babylon still glows in inherited memory. But Hatti, the empire that once stood equal to Egypt, becomes a problem without a solution. There are hints of a people called Hittites in ancient texts, but the scale of their power is not obvious. No one looking only at the better-known traditions would easily imagine that a great Bronze Age kingdom had once ruled from the rugged heart of Anatolia, commanded Syria, fought Rameses II, and helped shape the diplomacy of the ancient world. The rediscovery begins not with one dramatic revelation, but with a slow accumulation of clues. Travellers and scholars in Anatolia notice strange ruins, monumental stones, carved figures, and inscriptions that do not fit neatly into familiar categories. At first, many of these remains are misidentified or poorly understood. Some are attributed to peoples already famous from classical or biblical tradition. Others are treated as curiosities from an uncertain past. The ancient Near East was being reconstructed piece by piece in the 19th century, and the Hittites were still mostly a shadow at the edge of that reconstruction. The evidence was there, but the language needed to read it had not yet fully returned. Hattusa's identification changes everything. Near the modern village of Boazkoi, the ruins reveal a city far too large and sophisticated to belong to a minor forgotten tribe. Massive walls, gates, temples, and archives begin to show the outline of a major capital. When excavations uncover thousands of cuneiform tablets, the silence starts to break. These tablets are not decorative relics. They are the paperwork of estate treaties, rituals, laws, letters, instructions, myths, prayers, diplomatic exchanges, and royal records. Suddenly the forgotten empire has its own voice again, though at first that voice is difficult to understand. The decipherment of the Hittite language is one of the great intellectual achievements in the recovery of ancient history. Scholars recognize that many tablets are written in cuneiform, a writing system already known from Mesopotamian studies, but the language itself is not Akkadian or Sumerian. The breakthrough comes when Hittite is shown to be an Indo-European language, astonishingly ancient and unlike what many had expected from the heart of Anatolia. This realization reshapes not only Hittite studies, but the wider understanding of Indo-European linguistic history. A language buried in royal archives becomes a key to deep human movement, contact, and cultural transformation. The evidence remains incomplete in many areas, but the recovery of Hittite speech gives the empire back a kind of life. What emerges from the tablets is not the fantasy of a lost super-civilization, but something more compelling, a real state with real anxieties. The Hittites are not mysterious because they possessed impossible technology or secret wisdom. They are mysterious because they show how much complexity can vanish when archives fall silent. Their kings worry about succession, rebellion, plague, divine anger, military obligations, and the loyalty of vassals. Their scribes preserve foreign myths and local rituals. Their diplomats write to Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and smaller courts. Their laws reveal a society concerned with compensation, status, property, injury, and order. Their treaties show a world where political agreements are sealed before gods, mountains, rivers, and the terrifying possibility of curse. This recovered Hittite world also corrects the Egyptian story. Rameses II remains magnificent, but he no longer stands alone as the unquestioned master of the age. Kadesh becomes not simply a pharaoh's victory scene, but a contested event between two powerful empires. The peace treaty becomes not an act of Egyptian generosity, but a recognition of Hittite equality. Syria becomes not a passive stage for Egyptian campaigns, but a living frontier where local rulers navigate between imperial systems. The Hittites force modern history to become less one-sided. They remind us that the loudest monuments are not always the most reliable witnesses. Archaeology continues to complicate the picture. Each excavation, each tablet fragment, each seal impression, each inscription in hieroglyphic Luwian adds detail and uncertainty together. Scholars still debate many things: the early formation of Hittite identity, the exact meaning of some rituals, the sequence of certain campaigns, the role of Tahun-Tassa, the causes of collapse, the relationship between climate stress and political breakdown, the identities of some Western lands named in Hittite texts, and the degree to which later Neo-Hittite states preserved imperial traditions. This uncertainty is not failure. It is the honest shape of ancient evidence. The Hittites return to history not as a solved puzzle, but as a civilization complex enough to keep resisting simple explanation. Their legacy is therefore double. In their own age, they changed the balance of the Late Bronze Age. They broke Mitanni's dominance, held northern Syria, fought Egypt to a standstill, made one of the most famous treaties in ancient diplomacy, and built a capital that still feels severe and commanding in ruin. In the modern age, they changed the way history is written. They showed that a power can disappear almost completely from common memory and still be recovered through patient reading of clay, stone, and landscape. They proved that absence is not the same as insignificance. The forgotten warriors who terrified Egypt were never merely warriors. They were administrators of a difficult empire, collectors of gods, makers of oaths, trainers of horses, builders of gates, survivors of plague, rivals of pharaohs, and victims of the same fragile networks that made them great. Their world rose from the hard plateau of Anatolia and reached toward the richest corridors of the Near East. Then, under pressures no wall could fully resist, it broke apart. But the break was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a much longer silence, and then, much later, a return. In the end, the Hittites leave one of history's most unsettling lessons. Civilizations do not need to be imaginary to feel like legends. They only need to be forgotten long enough. The wind still moves through Hattusa. It crosses the empty ground where scribes once pressed signs into wet clay, where priests carried offerings through temple courts, where royal messengers arrived with news from Syria, where anxious kings wondered whether the gods were angry or the frontiers were failing. Nothing there now shouts. The ruins do not explain themselves quickly. They ask for patience, a carved lion, a broken wall, a tunnel under stone, a tablet darkened by ancient fire. Each offers only a fragment, and yet together the fragments become almost unbearably human. The Hittites are gone, but not in the simple way a candle goes out. They are gone like a road buried beneath later roads, like a name misremembered until someone learns the old language again, like thunder fading beyond mountains while the storm it carried still shapes the valley below. They feared their gods, trusted their oaths, sharpened their weapons, counted their grain, trained their horses, and believed, as all great powers do, that their world could be held together if only the right king ruled, the right rituals were performed, the right enemies were defeated, and the right promises were kept. But time is stronger than confidence. It wears down walls, scatters dynasties, changes languages, and turns capitals into questions. Egypt remembered its glory in stone, but even Egypt had to make room for the rival from the north. Hatti remembered itself in clay, and the clay slept until strangers learned to listen. Between those two kinds of memory lies the fragile truth of the Bronze Age: no empire stands outside history. No treaty freezes the world forever. And no victory is complete enough to silence the future. What remains is not only collapse, it is also recovery. The Hittites return because people kept looking, digging, comparing signs, doubting easy answers, and letting broken evidence speak in its own difficult rhythm. Out of ash and fragments, an empire reappears, not perfect, not whole, not stripped of mystery, but real enough to stand again beside Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and the other giants of the ancient world. And so the last image is not a battlefield, not a burning gate, not even a pharaoh facing a Hittite king across a treaty tablet. It is the high Anatolian landscape at dusk, the stones cooling after sunset, the old walls casting long shadows over the grass. Somewhere beneath that quiet ground, the voices of a forgotten empire remain pressed into clay, waiting in the dark, as if history itself is holding one more breath.